So. All right. Before we hop in, I'll just give a brief kind of intro on what we're going to be doing here today. Are we rolling?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, so my name is Jeremy Strickland. I'm a joint degree candidate at Kellogg School of Management and here at HKS. I'm an MPP1, the Delta cohort for those of you that I haven't met. My previous background was I worked at Google for 5 years, and the majority of the time I spent in a management consultant role, working for a team called BizOps. Essentially, we were a group of internal management consultants that tackled projects similar to what Roy and others would do in actual management consulting. And I'm going to be your interviewee today.
Great. So I think you guys all know me. My name is Roy. I used to work at McKinsey before coming to HKS in Asia. And basically really happy to do this for you guys, and today I'll be playing the interviewer role. So I think a couple of ground rules for us to set up. We will be recording because a lot of people couldn't make today's session, and so they wanted to see the video recording afterwards. The way we're going to run it is I will give Jeremy a mock case that's a real McKinsey case that's given by the company. And so basically I'll ask him a few questions, he'll answer them, and then after he answers each section, we'll probably take a pause, and then we'll give feedback, and then you guys can also ask any questions and make it interactive. And then we'll go through an entire case and then debrief at the end. So, feel free to ask any questions in between, things like that. Yeah.
There's a question before you start. This feels like a very awkward way to conduct an interview with two people sitting next to each other. Is that standard, though?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, so typically what happens
You want to do the corner.
Yeah, so typically it'll be like this, right?
Yeah, so you would sit like right there.
Yeah.
So like normally it would be like you would be sitting there and I would be sitting here.
Okay.
And ideally we would be kind of huddled in together doing like this.
Yeah.
When you walk into the room, they're going to have you sit across from each other. I think that's fine for the behavioral part of the interview when you're talking about your leadership experience, because it's really like you're engaging in like a one-on-one conversation. Think of this when you're doing the case as your joint problem solving, and like you want to build that sense of camaraderie by moving in closer.
The other thing also is that you, whenever you're doing a case, whether you're doing calculations or whether you're writing a structure down, you always want to show the interviewer what you're doing, right? So you always want to basically involve him in the process by like writing things down and then showing him exactly what is happening. And so in this case, because of the document camera, we just can't really do that. So yeah.
So I'm going to do my best to write big, things like that. If for some reason you can't read anything, we're going to go a little bit slower than we normally would. I might have a couple of inline comments here and there as to why I'm doing certain things. So before we kick off, I just want to show you what I've done originally here. So what I've done is, first thing is I've turned my page to landscape mode. This just makes things much cleaner, allows for a much nicer organization going forward, and I think you're going to see that. The next thing that I've done is I've gone ahead and pre-numbered 3 pages, right? This is just to help me when I'm going back and doing my synthesis and my final conclusion to walk through each of these 3 pages in kind of sequential order. And then finally, what I've done is I put over to the side here a page called Scratch. This is just going to be used for any sort of calculations that I need. And if I don't end up using this is fine. At an interview, they will collect your pages. Some of them will review them, some of them will not review them. You should generally, the best way to think about doing each one of your pages here is each one of these should be a slide, right? So think about this as, I'm trying to present this in slide format. Cool? Great.
Sorry, maybe can we try to pull down the blinds there? It's hard to see what's on your page in the camera.
Sure. Yep. So I think those were all very good tips. So a little bit of background about the case. This is one that's shared by the McKinsey Boston office, and so this will be a very close simulation to what the actual interview will look like. And then you guys can see how Jeremy does it, and then feel free to suggest anything and things like that as we go along. Okay, so with that, I think we're ready to kick off.
Let's roll.
Let's do it. Okay, so let's assume that our client is a private equity company, and it's headquartered in the United States, and this company is called Investment Capital Partners, or ICP for short. ICP is very intrigued by the idea of making a major investment to develop a national chain of food trucks. They've asked the team to determine the prospects for whether or not this is a good decision. Now, some background information about the company. ICP currently holds a wide portfolio of American-based investments, including a national pizza chain and a private jet company.
It's a really odd mix, Roy.
Exactly, it is. But that's what a private equity does, right? It buys from multiple industries. And it's always on the lookout for fast-growing, profitable businesses to invest in. Now, food trucks, which typically operate out of a converted mid-sized truck, usually contain a small kitchen, and they serve customers a wide variety of foods based in metropolitan areas. Now, food trucks typically specialize in a certain cuisine. For example, Mexican, Belgian waffles, Korean, things like that.
Forgot barbecue.
Exactly. They operate on a simple model. There's a kitchen inside the truck. There's a driver who's also typically the manager. And there are 1 to 2 cooks, depending on the volume. And the CEO has asked the McKinsey team to investigate whether ICP should invest in creating a national chain of food trucks. Okay? So, before we move further on, do you have any clarifying questions for me?
It's just 1 second while I write down the main question here. Great. Roy, before I go into my clarifying questions, what I would really like to do is just to repeat back some of the key facts that you've told me here today, just to make sure that I not only understand our company, but also the main challenge that we are trying to address. Is that okay?
Yep.
Great. So our client is going to be Investment Capital Partners, known as ICP.
Yep.
They've hired us today to look into the central question of should they invest in a national chain of food trucks. Food trucks are a growing industry, and this company has a particular interest given some of their other investments, maybe in the pizza chain. Seem to be maybe some nice synergies there. So one quick clarifying question on that point, are we to assume that the food trucks would be pizza-based?
No. So what we'll find out later in the case is that the pizza truck will actually, or the food truck will actually be Mexican food based, right? So, take that for what it is.
Great. That was really my only kind of clarifying question. Just wanted to make sure of that. With that in mind, we know that food trucks generally work in metropolitan areas and they employ a small staff. With that in mind, I think that the primary question that we want to answer today is should ICP enter this market, and would doing so be profitable to them?
That's correct.
Great.
Good. So let's take a pause real fast, right? That was the beginning of the case, and that's usually how most cases begin. Usually the interviewer will give you a set of facts or information, and they'll give you the prompt saying that, this is a particular company in this industry, here is the background information, here are the facts, and then would you or would you not do something, right? And so before he moves on to questions saying, what would you think about or how would you calculate this, what Jeremy did was he recited the facts, right? So he basically said what I had told him in a different way and basically clarified all the information. And that's exactly what you should do, right? So once the interviewer gives you the set of facts, repeat it back to him in your own words and make sure that you have all the information correct. That serves to do 2 things. One is it makes sure that the interviewer feels like he's being listened to and that you have all the facts. The other thing is if you've heard something that you might have heard wrong. So for example, if he said 15%, but you heard 50%, it's good to clarify that information. So repeat back that information before you move on to anything else. That's priority number 1.
And I'd also just kind of like to call out the amount of stuff that I wrote down here. This is traditionally a little bit more than what I would ever write down. Right? I think this is a little bit too much, and it is a little bit repetitive, but I wanted to do it for this exercise. Please also note that when I was like repeating back to him the facts that Roy gave me and the central problem that we're trying to answer, I didn't go through each one of these points. I kind of hit highlights. It's a PE firm. They're looking to invest in food trucks. Is it going to be just pizza since they own a pizza chain? Things like that. This is also a really good point that if there's any sort of term you don't understand, let's say you get a healthcare case and they start talking about premiums and deductibles, it is very important to define your term there and make sure that you understand absolutely what that is. And if you still don't understand what that is after this part, just be like, oh, a premium. Is that kind of like revenue for an insurance firm? That's a really great kind of analogy to make. But it's important that you have that understanding at this point.
Cool. So with that, why don't we move on to the first question?
Please.
So given the background facts of the case, what areas would you want to explore first to understand whether ICP should pursue the idea of investing in a national chain of food trucks?
Roy, would you mind if I took a couple minutes just to organize my thoughts here?
Perfect, go for it.
Okay, Roy, thank you for that time. I think I'm ready to proceed. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, great. So, Roy, to go back and address your original question, you said, what are some factors that I would consider? So I've tried to come up with a list here of kind of key dimensions that I would like to evaluate this opportunity on. My initial hypothesis is that ICP should not invest in this opportunity. Of course, I'm open to refining that hypothesis and changing it should new facts come along and present themselves. I'd at least like to start from that point of view. Originally on my page I wrote down 5 factors, but I actually crossed one off, so I want to start with the 4 that I kept. The first one are customers. Who are they? What do they want to eat in a food truck? How much what's their average purchase price, and how often will they purchase? We'd really like to understand who these customers are in order to see is this even going to be an exciting opportunity for us to enter if we create this food truck. Second, I would like to look at our capabilities. We're a PE firm. We're not Yum Foods, right? So it's interesting to me that we're thinking about doing this national food truck chain. So that means that we're either going to have to acquire an existing food truck company, we're going to have to develop these capabilities ourselves. That's going to be buying trucks, getting line cooks, coming up with menus, etc. Or we're going to have to somehow leverage our existing kind of infrastructure and capabilities. Well, we've already talked about the pizza chain and how that this isn't going to be a pizza chain food truck. So I've crossed out existing, but I did want to let you know that I had thought about that. The next thing that I would like to look at is market size. I think this is a just pretty straightforward question. What's our addressable market here? What markets are we going to go into? How many of them? Are we going to start small and expand? What are the number? How many food trucks are we going to have in each market? By understanding what the total amount of kind of revenue and market sizes that we can capture in any one given market, we can extrapolate that out over a larger range to see if this is going to be a profitable opportunity for us. And then finally, I want to think about just taking a step back. This is a PE firm. PE firms have extremely high growth targets and essentially high return on invested capital, right? So we really want to make sure that the opportunity cost of this opportunity does not outweigh some of the other potential investments they could be considering. So those are the kind of four main factors I would look at least to start. Of course, there are others, but I don't want to write too many down because I want to be cognizant of time. With that, I want to briefly mention why I crossed off competitors here. You know, I was thinking about this like food market industry, or I'm sorry, food truck industry, and I was thinking of like the larger food market. Like, who are our competitors? Like, how big is that funnel? Is the question that was in my mind. Are these going to be other restaurants? Are these going to be essentially people packing their own lunch? Is it going to be? Are we going to narrowly define that market, right, and competitors to be other food trucks who are in the area? Is it other food trucks who are serving just tacos, like I think you mentioned a little bit earlier? I think this could be an interesting area, but I think that's going to require a little bit more input from other sources, so I've at least crossed that off for right now.
Okay, so I want to challenge a couple of things real fast.
Sure.
You know, in this industry, you talked about the market size, right, and also the customers and things like that. Those are external things. Did you consider the profitability or the economics of owning a food truck?
Yeah, absolutely. With any sort of investment for a PE firm, you have to really think about, is this going to be the right investment for this firm, right? As we know, profits are revenues minus cost. And so we want to ensure that the addressable market is large enough so that we can capture enough revenue in the one market or several markets that we expand into to where we can not only break even, but we can cover costs and ultimately turn a profit. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that the profits that we are able to achieve over a long-term horizon do align with our return on capital goals.
Got it, okay. So profitability is one of the things that you would consider, right?
Yes, absolutely. And let me be explicit in that I've kind of baked it into these particular frameworks here when thinking about what is the price per purchase and quantity, and then ultimately what's the addressable market. So I didn't explicitly write that out, but I do want to let you know that I have considered it.
Okay. And then the other thing is, I see that you've crossed out competitors,
Yeah.
and I'm glad that you at least considered it, right?
Yeah.
The only pushback that I would have is, in any kind of industry, especially the food truck industry, right? In order for a new company to enter in and to be successful, wouldn't you want to consider the competitors and the competitive landscape before you make that decision ultimately?
Absolutely. And I think we're in 100% alignment there. I think I just need a little bit more clarity on how we are defining that competitive landscape. If that is definitely a factor that I would like to look at. It probably would not be the first factor, given how broadly we could define that market. And I think that's really going to require a lot of customer research and individual market research.
Great.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
Thank you.
So let's take a pause there, right? And let's just debrief on what happened. So I asked a question, which was, what factors would you think about? And I think regardless of which company you interview for, right? Whether it's McKinsey, Bain, BCG, Deloitte, anything, right? After the initial recitation of the facts, the first question is always going to take some variation of what are the factors you would think about, or, you know, how would you approach this case, or, you know, what key things would you consider as you do your analysis, right? And it's up to the interviewee to basically come up with a structure that can capture at least 80 to 90% of the total number of issues, right? And that's what Jeremy did in a structured form. And so there's a lot of people, what they do is they literally just list out everything that they can possibly think of, and they list out in bullet form, but that's not a structured way. And what I especially like about Jeremy's approach is that, as you can see here, he has 5 categories and he crossed out 1 category. And he basically said, okay, the 4 things that I would look at are customers, capabilities, market size, and company. And then he went through each one in short bullet points to tell me exactly what he was thinking about. He walked me through his thought process. And even though he crossed out competitors, right, which could potentially be an important thing.
Apparently it was a mistake.
No, but see, that's the thing. So even though he crossed it out, right, he at least told the interviewer that this is something that I considered, and he had a good debate with the interviewer about why he chose to cross it out, right? So as long as you cover all of your bases, it's mostly fine. Now the thing is, once you are asked that question, what areas would you think about? Usually take about a minute or 2 to gather all your thoughts and literally write them down on the page. And then when you're finished writing, basically walk through point by point to the interviewer.
Yep.
And that I think is exactly what Jeremy did. So that was quite good. Anything else that you want to say?
Yeah, I just add a couple of points. It's not only enough to just hit the high level buckets and say capabilities. You have to tell the interviewer why you want to know that information, right? So taking capabilities for an example, I want to know, like, how do we build this capacity to serve our customers? If this is really expensive for us to do, it's not going to be worthwhile, right? And Roy did a really good job pushing back on me about my profitability. Another explicit category that I could have put in here would have been profitability, but I felt that I was kind of brushing up on that 1 to 2 minute mark, so I didn't want to, as the term goes, kind of boil the ocean with all my categories. So I kind of just baked it into my others. If it's more helpful for you, you can split that out. Now, going forward, what I am going to do is I'm not going to touch this sheet again, except for to refine my hypothesis up front. And always the first thing that you should do, at least I found it helpful, and I think this is a golden rule, state your hypothesis. Even if it's something that you don't feel very strong about at the beginning, just state something so you can come back and refine it. Now, the only thing, like I said, the only thing I'm going to do is just cross this off if I do end up refining it, but otherwise I'm just going to put it up here. I generally like to put it in front of me so that I always have it on my mind as we're approaching the next parts of the case.
Yep.
Are we taking questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I wasn't sure. So that was the hypothesis was the first thing you wrote down, if I remember correctly.
Yes. So the way that I like to do
it. You sort of made
it.
a split-second decision.
Yeah, because think about this. What's the central question that we're really trying to answer? Should they enter this market, yes or no? And so for me, like, this is a PE firm. Like, this has got to be a really lucrative opportunity for them to enter in here. So my initial hypothesis is I'm pretty leery, right? And that's what I try to communicate to Roy, kind of subtly in my responses. It's like I really want to make sure this is the best investment opportunity that like Bain Capital or like one of these other companies has.
Yeah, and it's usually a first impulse, right?
Okay.
Like what you think of the answer to this case to be, then you can refine it later on. Now, Jeremy, what he did is he had that intuition, so he wrote it down first and then his points. Another approach to do is you write down your points first, and after thinking about, okay, the customers, capabilities, market size, and company, right? Do I still think this is a good company to invest in? So there is a merit to also writing down your points first and then writing down your thesis. The last thing that I'll say before we move on is that, in the time frame of a minute or 2 minutes when you're preparing for this, you don't need to hit all of your bases, right? And there really isn't a way that you literally get 100% of all the points. And that's exactly what happened here. So he got 80 to 90% of them, but some of the things like, for example, profitability and competition, it wasn't able to hit, which is totally fine, right? Don't kill yourself over the last 10 or 20%. It's just not worth it. It's better to present what you have, and then when the interviewer asks you questions, then think about those things and have a dialogue with them. Right?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you noticed when Roy started asking me questions about profitability, my body language changed. I turned, I opened up, we were having more of a conversation rather than me just looking down straight at my paper.
Yep.
Cool. All right, let's move on to the next part.
Great. So, one of the things that I had mentioned, Jeremy, was the profitability.
Oh,
and so let's do something around that. So let's assume that the team has decided to start assessing the potential profitability of a typical food truck. The team has spent a full day working inside of a vegan taco truck near the client's headquarters.
Ooh, okay.
And they've compiled some initial profitability data for this one truck.
Okay.
However, before meeting ICP's chief financial officer, they want to expand this analysis to also include a wider menu of meat tacos as well. Okay. So I want to give you some data for you to look at and analyze, and then I'll ask you to do some calculations as well.
Cool.
Great.
Can I just repeat back just what I heard, just to
Yep.
make sure I have it right? So essentially, one of our teams has done some analysis on what is a typical food truck.
Mhm.
They call it around a vegan taco truck. And the question that's been posed to us now is essentially they're thinking about adding a new product,
That's
a
right.
meat taco.
That's right.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. So let's put this here and make sure that people can see. You guys see this, by the way?
Let's get this over slightly.
I need to zoom in a little bit.
Oh, wait a minute, this up here. Okay, cool. So bear with us, guys,
Yeah.
on this.
Okay. So maybe let's just see if we can.
All right.
Okay.
So normally I would take up more of the page to write this, but I'm going to try to do it just like in vertical format.
Yeah.
So that's just an aside.
Okay. So the team will share this analysis with the CFO. It shows
Cool.
projected revenues and costs associated with the annual operation of a single food truck.
Cool.
Okay. And basically, for those of you that can't see, this says meat tacos, veggie tacos, and beverages. This is the price per unit. This is the volume, the expected volume that they're going to sell for each item. And then this is the cost of ingredients for each of these three items. Okay? And then these are the different fixed cost components. So for example, the costs include labor, utilities, insurance, maintenance, rent, and other. Right? And it gives a short description of what that cost is. And so, given this information, Jeremy,
Yes.
right? Given the fact that we currently sell veggie tacos and
Cool.
beverages, right? And we have the cost and the price structure of each one,
Yep.
right? The thing that we don't know right now is meat tacos, and we're expected to sell 40,000 units,
Yep.
and also the cost per meat taco is $1,
Yep.
right? Assuming that if we now sell meat tacos
Yep.
and these costs do not go up as a result of that, how many meat tacos? So the meat tacos, what price would you need to charge for each meat taco in order for this food truck to break even?
The food truck as a whole to break even.
Exactly.
So just to confirm, this is where profits would be zero and revenues would equal costs.
Exactly.
Great. Okay. So, Roy, I'm going to start with just an initial kind of sub-hypothesis that meat tacos, we should charge $2 per taco, and I just want to refine this as I go out. And let me tell you how I came to that. Essentially, I see that the cost of bottles and the cost of ingredients here and here is 50 cents. We're doubling that for the meat tacos to $1. So just kind of my natural intuition here is that we should charge double that.
To have the same profits, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's, obviously we may actually see this is not true, but it's helpful for me to use this as a starting point.
Sure.
Great. So essentially the problem that we're trying to solve for here today is break even, or what is the price of this meat taco given that we are trying to break even. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we know the break even point is where profits equal zero or where revenue equals costs. So revenue can be broken down, or we know that revenue can equals price per unit times the quantity of units sold. Great. And so I'm just going to slide this over slightly so everybody can see. Actually, you know what? I'll move this down. Great. And we know that cost can be broken down into two components. Total variable cost plus total fixed cost. Okay. Now, given the information that I have here, I think I already have some of this information, and we can start plugging in and see what I need to solve for.
Sure.
So in terms of the fixed cost, which is going to be this area right here, I think all we need to do is essentially just sum this up.
Mhm.
So let me do some quick math here. 48, 53, 56, 59, 65, 85. So our fixed costs are $85,000. Now we know our variable costs are going to be let's see, it's going to be the variable cost times the quantity.
Mhm.
So I think this is going to be a little bit of a more meaty calculation. So let's first solve for quantity. So quantity of total tacos sold is going to be X times 40,000 plus 0.5, and this is the cost for the veggie tacos, times 10,000 plus 0.5 times 20,000.
Can you move
Okay.
the sheet up a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
Before you move on any
Sure.
further, right? I see what you did here. So basically what you did is you said each of these volumes, let's times it by the cost of the ingredients, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, I
So
see.
then
this
for
should
this
actually
one-
be 1. I'm sorry. I just misspoke.
Exactly. So this is not X, right? This
Yep,
is 1.
that's 1.
Good.
I'm sorry. I just was looking at one thing and wrote down the other.
Yep.
Side, that's totally fine. If you write something down wrong, just admit to it.
Yeah.
Fix it. So thank you for calling that out. I
Mhm.
actually noticed when I looked back at it as well.
Yep.
So thank you for that. Okay, great. So our total quantity is going to be, that's 5,000, that's 10,000. So we're looking at 55,000. Is that correct?
For the total fixed cost?
Yeah, I'm
The
for
total
the,
variable cost, that's right.
okay, great. So perfect. So let's toss this in here. So our total variable cost is 55K plus the 85K. And then this equals, just adding these together, 130, 140.
Okay. Good.
Okay, great. So, well, we got half the solution here. So now we just need to go back and figure out the revenue component, and from there we can back into the price that we should charge for meat tacos, right? So we know if we go and we plug in up here, so the price per unit is essentially, or our revenue will equal X times 40,000
Mhm.
plus 1 times 10,000 plus, stuck in my hand, plus 1 times 20,000.
Okay.
Great. And so this is going to be 40,000 X plus 30,000.
Okay.
Great. And we know that at the break-even point, revenue will equal cost, so we know that this will equal 140,000.
Yes.
Awesome. So I'm just going to,
Move this over, it's fine.
I'm going to draw an arrow here.
Mhm.
Great, perfect. Just want to make sure you can see it. So that is $110,000. Yep. Equals 40x.
40,000.
40,000x, excuse me, yes. So let me just write this in notation that's a little bit easier for me so I can solve this math problem. Essentially 110 divided by 40. That's pretty close to $3. I think, let me just do this math. Is that 275?
That's correct.
Great. 275. All right, well, let me go back and refine my initial hypothesis. We originally said that we should charge $2 for meat tacos. I would now like to refute that hypothesis and refine it and say that we should charge, based on this analysis, to break even, $275.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you?
It does, and that's the correct calculation. Does that seem feasible?
Wow, that's a really good question. Let me think about that for a second. You know, my initial instinct on this tells me yes, it does, and for a couple of different reasons. One, the volume of the meat tacos looks like this is going to be our best seller. So we're thinking just pure supply and demand, right? There's just a much higher demand for this taco, so it seems like that we could charge a premium for it. Having said that, I would also like to know what our competitors that are also offering taco options are charging in terms of their taco.
Yeah.
Also, with that in mind, I have this natural inclination that meat tacos are probably going to be a little bit more expensive to produce. So I know that we've gone through this break-even analysis here, but I just wonder that if the cost of ingredients, since it's $1, then once we actually get into it, it might even be a little bit higher. So I'm worried about the profit margins on those. So I do think that is fair. Relative to the other tacos, it does look a little bit more expensive, but I think there's a way that we could potentially brand or promote this taco.
To market it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And personally, I'm a meat taco guy, so you wouldn't have to sell me very much. But I know that there's a lot of people out there that they're just focused on dollars and cents.
Great.
So
Great. Okay, let's take another pause here. Okay. Why don't we show this information really quickly and let me just walk them through. Okay. So you guys understand? Do you guys understand how Jeremy came up with those calculations?
Okay. First of all, before Roy even goes into that, when they hand you a sheet, never write on it.
Yeah, that's right.
If you need to, take the time and copy down the chart.
Yeah, that's actually my only copy of the case. So good that you didn't write on it. But basically, this is a typical quantitative question that they would ask you during the case interview. They would give you a set of numbers, a set of facts, and then they would basically ask you to either calculate the profitability or the number of units that you need to sell or the price that you would need to charge in order to break even, right? And then you basically use the data here to solve that information. And what Jeremy did is he actually walked me through his entire process and how he did that calculations. When I've done interviews in the past, and I've interviewed people, there are a lot of times where people just do the calculations themselves. Sometimes they get the right answer, sometimes they don't, right? But the issue is that if you don't walk the interviewer through your entire thought process and literally walk through every step that you took, if you get the wrong answer, there's no way for the interviewer to know where you went wrong, and there's no way that he can guide you and get you to the right solution. So that was a very good practice, which is he wrote down all of his numbers in a very structured way. He put them in specific categories, and then he walked me through every step of the way. And as you notice, there were a couple of times where Jeremy made some minor mistakes. For example, saying 40x instead of 40,000x, and also doing x times 10,000 instead of 1 times 10,000. But by walking me through the calculations one by one, I was able to catch some of his very small mistakes, and he was still able to solve the problem in a really good way, right? And I think during the actual case interview, making these types of small mistakes but still getting to the right answer is perfectly fine. And I think he passed with flying colors here. Thanks.
Yeah, just being on the other side of the table here, like when I've done these, when I was at Google, the 1 instead of the X, that was definitely something that Roy pointed that out to me. Essentially, I was just jumping to the revenue calculation, and I just need to go back and fix that. So just acknowledge, oops, wrote down the wrong thing here, just looked at the column wrong.
Yeah.
It's a pretty easy fix, probably wouldn't hold that against you. And then the other thing is, there's a couple other things I just want to point out on the sheet. When I come to a number, I double underline it. So I know that this is important. This is not only important for this segment of the case, but when I'm coming back and doing my synthesis and conclusion, I know what are the things that I need to look at. Does that make sense? I also started with a hypothesis here that meat tacos should be $2. You don't have to do that. It's just always helpful for me to have a hypothesis and go back and refine. So in general, what I would have liked to have done is a break even, like in this section right here, like revenues and costs with more space, so that I could do this final equation where I set it right here. I could just plug this up and into right under the break even equation. But the thing that I did was, there are two other things I just want to quickly point out. Everything that I did before I ever did a math calculation, I wrote it down in words. And then when I wrote it down in words, I checked with Roy. Implicitly, either looking for a slight head nod or, does this make sense to you? Some sort of kind of verbal or visual cue like that to make sure that I'm not doing something wrong.
Right. And the last thing I'll say before we move on is that if we look back at the actual data here, right, we see that veggie tacos, the price that they sell it at is $1. The beverages is also $1, right? And so we had to calculate what the meat tacos were. At the end, when he got the final answer, he got $2.75 that he used to charge for a meat taco, right? It's enough to answer the question and say, okay, we need to charge $2.75. The best type of responses basically give a sort of judgment after you come to that number. So you basically say something like, oh, well, I see that veggie tacos are sold for $1 and beverages are sold for $1, right? $2.75, in my opinion, sounds reasonable or sounds not reasonable, and here's why, right? And so it's not just calculating the end number, it's also ascribing a type of judgment and a recommendation as a part of it. So that was good.
Great.
Cool. Let's move on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in general, you said how you were looking at the interview for every step and so forth, but in the interview, would you expect that the interview gives you feedback on every step of your thought process, or does the interview just keep quiet?
Yeah, they won't give you any feedback. You can read verbal cues, and you can generally know how the interview's going just by looking at Roy. If he's smiling and entertained and taking his time going through the case, that means that Roy has made that judgment in his mind that hey, this is probably going pretty well. If Roy's reading through the case super quickly, at least in my opinion, it's maybe there might have been some mistake. So you won't get feedback. The only time you will get feedback is between your first and second round.
And so like he corrected you at that one point? Was that
Oh, no, yes, that's fine. When I just wrote something down wrong, that's why you're checking it. Because you want to think of this as like a conversation. So that's not like, what I thought you meant by feedback is like what we're doing like kind of more right now. Just that, you wrote down X instead of 1. So like, can you double check that for me?
Yeah, I think what he's asking is like during the actual interview, will interviewers actually take the time to correct you if they see that you've done something wrong?
And
Right.
I would say
Most of the time, yes.
most of the times, unless it's not going well. Cool.
I had a question. I was wondering if the pace at which you recited the case in the beginning is typical of the pace that they'll read it during.
It varies. I would say that was probably a little bit on the slow side, just because I wanted him to capture the information correctly. Sometimes they'll read it to you like they would read it generally in a pretty fast pace, and the biggest challenge is that you need to just write down the most important key things. Like there's no way for you to write down everything, and that's part of what they're testing is that. Given this huge blob of information, that you're capturing and discerning the pieces that are the most important, right? So, be prepared for faster readouts. I would say.
Yeah, just like going back to this, like that's why I abbreviate things. So C is client, what's the question we're trying to answer, what's the background, what's the goal? Like probably I would have killed this, wouldn't have written this, probably wouldn't have written this. That's probably important, and then I probably wouldn't have written this again. Like thinking about that, but if Roy was going a little bit slower, then just for demonstration purposes.
Okay. And they'll always read the case to you. They won't
Yes.
hand you a sheet with
So they'll always read the case to you. They'll only hand you sheets when they give you data, which is like graphs and things like that.
Yeah. And again, just never write on those.
Yeah. Cool. So let's move on to the next question.
Okay.
Let's refer back to this graph.
Yeah.
Right, or this chart.
Cool.
So this chart obviously shows you the components of profitability for this food truck.
Yeah.
Right. Looking at this data right
Yeah.
now and assuming that all of this information is correct, what do you think are some ideas or ways that you can improve the profitability of this food truck?
Oh. Okay. Would you mind if I took a couple moments just to structure my thoughts?
Sure.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to move this to the side so that y'all can see what I'm actually doing. That's supposed to be a joke. Okay, Roy, thank you for that time. I have written down a few thoughts here. And I just
I want to pull it up a little bit.
Is that good for everyone? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, and I just want to kind of run you through some of my initial thoughts. So your question was, how can this food truck improve profitability? We know that the profitability equation is that profits equal revenue minus cost. We talked about that a little bit. Essentially, there are two ways that you can increase profitability at a kind of fundamental level. They are either to increase revenue or lower costs, creating that a wider profit margin per taco sold. So quickly, I want to walk you through 3 different ways that I thought about increasing revenue, and 3 different ways that I would like to explore in terms of lowering costs. First, on the revenue side, one of the things that I really like to look into is possibly expanding the product line. So we see that if we go back to this sheet here, that we're currently only offering 4 different products. I wonder if there is an ability for us to start offering some side dishes, or even a more expensive product, such as like a super duper awesome burrito, covered in nacho cheese or something like that, and charge a higher price premium for it. Second, I would really like to understand the absolute profits in this revenue equation. Well, let me make a distinction: absolute profits versus relative profits, right? So with profits, you can increase the per unit profit margin, or you can just kind of duplicate what you're doing and increase basically the absolute total amount of profits, so sum of profits. My idea there was, can we increase the number of food trucks in a given market? In metropolitan areas, I assume that most of these metropolitan areas are large enough to support multiple food trucks. If not, would it make sense for us to expand into different markets using the same model? Basically just copying what we've already done. And then third, I would really like to look into kind of promotions and deals. Since I'm making the slight assumption that this food truck is, I think, new, that we'd be entering this market, what type of kind of promotions and deals can we do to draw in customers and increase the quantity sold?
What's an example of a promotion or deal that you can think of in this case?
Yeah, come try out a taco truck, get a buy 2, get 1 free tacos, like the veggie tacos.
Okay.
So I think that would be really interesting. Perhaps doing a free taco night or a sponsored taco night at a local like sporting event, anything like that. Or business card giveaways, very classic one. You drop in a business card, get a free lunch.
Those are good ideas. What would you say about bundling? Have you considered that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think bundling is actually a really great option. So thinking about the classic McDonald's like value meal, right? So 3 tacos and a drink. I think that we would have even more credence in that regard if we did offer some sort of side dishes. So maybe thinking about tacos, maybe like the Mexican rice, or tortilla chips, or guacamole, or something like that. I think that would give our bundle a little bit more credence.
Got it. Okay, great.
And just the last thing that I wrote down here is lifetime value. By increasing the quantity, hopefully we can increase the lifetime value of our customers. They'll come back and they'll purchase more. Good. Great. So from the cost side of the equation, the first thing I wrote down here kind of as like a funny note to me is I took a look at these fixed costs, and Roy, like if I were advising this client, I see 2 big buckets here. I see labor and I see rent, and that's the 80-20 here. I think essentially those 2 categories are driving the predominant amount of costs that we see.
That's right.
So sure, there's probably areas to maybe lower some of those others. But let's start with the big meaty stuff first. Let's start with the meat taco.
Agreed.
Okay. So the 3 areas, or the 3 things that I wrote down, I just don't understand why rent is so high. It's $26,000 in this particular instance. I'm wondering how that's going to increase as we have more trucks. I wonder if there is some sort of tangible solution that we could either park our truck at somebody's home, find a cheaper solution, maybe, and I'm going to jump to this a little bit later, maybe partnering with somebody in the local area. So just want to really double click and explore into why that rent is so high, first of all.
Got it.
Second, I would like to look into flexible staffing. So we saw that labor was driving about $40,000 worth of the fixed cost here. And my concern is as we expand these trucks, that labor cost is going to get a little bit higher. So I wonder if we can adjust our labor so that it's more of a flexible demand model. Maybe have 2 cooks during the lunch hour, but maybe only have 1 cook a little bit later. Or if the driver manager can serve as a second line item cook.
Good idea.
Yeah. And then the third area, and this is, I alluded to this just a little bit earlier because I think it could potentially have ramifications for the first area, is a local partnership with a restaurant. I think what's really cool when I was living in San Francisco was I often saw like the food trucks were just an extension of the restaurant. The food trucks were often like independently owned and operated, but they serve the food from, I don't know, actually let me use an example from Chicago, like Purple Pig. Purple Pig's a kind of a really cool local restaurant.
And I was just there last weekend too.
It's great, right?
Yeah.
So they also had a food truck. And so the food truck was independently owned and operated, but the line item chefs and the food they served was associated with Purple Pig. So I wonder if there's a way that you could partner to not only drive down storage costs by possibly storing the food truck on their sites and their facilities, but also at the same time that would allow you to expand your menu. That would allow you potentially, if it's a premium restaurant, to charge higher prices. All sorts of kind of ramifications there.
Great. This is really good. Okay, so let's take another pause really quickly. So I think what Jeremy did there were a couple of things that I really liked and I wanted to point out, right? So the first thing is that, I asked him to do a further analysis of the data that was given, right? So how are some ways that he thinks he can potentially increase profitability? The first thing that I really liked is that he had a very distinct and strong structure to approach the problem. So he said, okay, profit is revenue and cost, and then for revenue, these are three distinct ideas that I have to increase the revenues. And then these are three distinct ideas to decrease the profitability. The second thing that I really liked is that Jeremy is very 80-20 here. And what we mean by 80-20 is you don't need to look at every little tiny thing. You look at the big bucket things that drive the most amount of impact. And so if you look at, for example, the cost here, Jeremy did that calculation before. The total fixed cost is around $85,000. There are two line items, labor and rent. When you add them together, they make up 80 to 90% of the entire cost, right? So rather than thinking about, okay, how do we decrease utilities and insurance and maintenance and other, why don't we focus on the ones that are the most important, that will drive the most impact, which is labor and rent, right? So he was very methodical about what his prioritization was. The third thing that I really liked is that when he was engaging me in the conversation, other than just solving the problem and telling us how to increase profitability, he brought in his own personal life and his personal experiences and connected with the interviewer, right? He was basically saying, I'm from Chicago. Purple Pig is a really good restaurant in Chicago. And it just so happened that last weekend I was in Chicago and I also ate at the Purple Pig, right? And so by infusing that kind of personal life experience into the interview process, it makes it more personable, it makes you connect with the interviewer more, and it just makes for a more fun experience, I think. So as much as you can incorporate your own life into the interview, it would create a really good rapport with the interviewer.
And I can guarantee you, I didn't know Roy actually ate Purple Pig last weekend. That was just a complete shot in the dark. But I can guarantee you that interviewer's going to remember you.
Yeah.
Oh, that's Andy. He ate the Purple Pig. I like that guy.
Mm.
He did well in this case. Thank you, Andy.
Exactly.
I just have one more comment. I really like your approach on the improvement of the profitability. And when what we can do one step further is to have one layer down below revenue and cost. You can talk about below revenue. There are two components on quantity and also the price. And for the cost, there is this fixed cost and also the variable cost. So one way it can show that you have a structure to the interviewer. On the other hand, it can actually help to guide you through. So on the cost side, we may also possibly think about the raw materials, like how to better do a central procurement and something like that. And by breaking it down into different components, one layer below it can definitely help you think about more approach.
Stacey's absolutely right. So I only looked really at the fixed cost here. I didn't even touch the variable cost, which that's not a necessarily bad thing, but Stacey's answer is a little bit better. So I agree with that.
Okay. If there's no other questions, let's move on to the final bit. So as you guys know, at the end of any of these case interviews, you're given a set of quantitative and qualitative questions to ask. At the end of the interview, there will always be a question where they ask you to sum up the case, right? And this can come in many forms. They might say, you see the CEO in the elevator the next day. He wants to know what the progress of the team is. What do you tell him in a minute or less, right? Or something like, let's sum up the case, tell me what you've learned and give me a recommendation or something like that, right? So whatever way they ask this question, they're looking for you to take the facts that you've learned in the case and then summarize it into one concise, like 30-second to 1 minute spiel, right? And basically show that you've recited the facts, that you know how to interpret them, and then you come up with a credible recommendation. So let's walk through that.
Great.
Okay, so Jeremy, thank you for that analysis so far.
Cool.
Let's assume that tomorrow the CFO of Investment
ICP.
Capital Partners, ICP, sees you in the elevator, and he really has heard a lot of really good things about what the McKinsey team has done so far.
Cool.
As you're getting into the elevator with him, you have about a minute's time. What are the things that you would tell him about the things that you've learned so far, and maybe what are some of the next steps?
Yeah, absolutely. Would you mind if I took maybe 90 seconds to
Go
collect
for
my
it.
thoughts? Okay, so aside so you can watch me here. Normally I would have these laid out in front of me, but I want all three of my sheets right here, and I'm going to work through each one of these sheets.
And while Jeremy's doing the conclusion part, right, there's one other thing that I want to clarify. And this question gets asked a lot, which is, when do you take time during a case interview and when do you immediately answer the question? And generally what I tell people is that when you feel like the interviewer is starting a completely new category or a new line of questioning, right, it's okay to take time. So for example, in the beginning, when they ask you what structure or what are the things that you would think about, that's when you take about a minute and a minute 30. When he asks you, okay, here's a piece of paper with data on it, how would you interpret this? Take a minute and a half, right? Same thing with the question about profitability. How would you increase the profitability? And then also at the conclusion, take about a minute or a minute and 30. But in the meantime, if the interviewer is asking just a follow-up question on an existing category or an existing line of questioning, that's a cue to not take time. Because if you take too much time and you do that too many times, it looks like you're a little unprepared. So just, be your own judge of when to take time. The general rule of thumb is like, once in the beginning, once in the end, and then maybe at maximum 2 times or so, 1 or 2 times in the middle of the case.
All right, Roy, thank you for that time. I'm almost done. Alright, since we're running a little short on time here, I'm just going to run through this super quickly. Normally I would write down 3 points here, but I'm going to go ahead and just jump into it. Roy, so to go back to the original question, the original question that we're trying to solve for ICP is, should they invest in this market? I originally told you that they shouldn't. I'm going to refine that hypothesis and say they should, and here are 3 reasons why. First, we did a profitability analysis and a break-even analysis, and the outcome looks to be favorable, at least on given this one vegan truck that we looked into. Second, there's this real potential for us to expand through additional product lines or entering new markets. And then third, we also looked into ways that we could basically drive incremental profits. So either by increasing the profit margin or increasing the other profits overall through expansion or secondary, tertiary trucks. Right? So for these 3 reasons, I do think that ICP should explore this opportunity a little bit more and potentially invest. However, there are some risks that I want to point out. We've talked about early on about competitors, and we talked about what a key point that was. We haven't done a competitive analysis yet. So my first next step is I would really like to understand this competitive landscape and to define, who are our competitors and how do we differentiate ourselves. Second, a lot of my answer has been contingent upon being able to grow and scale. So expansion opportunities and possibilities. I want to know if they're actually there. Is there demand for this type of truck and this type of service in these metropolitan areas? What does a typical metropolitan area look like, and how can we scale and grow this business? One truck's not going to cut it for a P from 50 to 100 trucks, just mine. Okay. Right? So really the next step there as well is an expansion/rollout analysis.
Good. Okay. So that was the end of the case interview, right? And that's generally when it would conclude. Now, I would say that when you're giving a conclusion, there are 3 things that Jeremy did, which I think are the anatomy of a great conclusion. So, they're going to ask you, so the main prompt was, do we invest in this taco truck or not? So the first thing he started out with is he recited the facts of the case. He said, okay, here are 3 reasons, right? The profitability, the incremental profitability, and then your third point was like
expansion rollout.
Expansion rollout or something like that, right? So given these 3 reasons that I've learned through my case, right, here's the basis of my conclusion. My conclusion is that we should go into this market, even though my initial hypothesis was that we should not. And so the first component was the facts, the second component was the actual conclusion, the third component was the next steps and risks. And I think he did a really good job of combining the 2 together. So now that you have this conclusion, what are the next things that you do, or the next pieces of analysis that you drive for? What are the potential risks of investing in something like that? And I think that's a really good way to conclude the interview, and then that would be the case.
I would suggest just following this exact format: conclusion, risk, next steps. Your conclusions should say, like, the way to think about this, what could potentially arise that would make these conclusions be void or refute them, right? Well, if we found out there was a really tough competitive environment in a lot of these metro areas, and there were already 20 taco trucks serving the area, that's probably not a good investment opportunity for us. That would also limit our expansion possibilities. So that leads me into the next steps. What we like to call follow-on work. What's the additional analysis given an unlimited amount of time that we would like to do? So each of these should build into each other. And just follow this format of conclusion, risk, next steps.
Yep. Okay, so that's the case interview. The only other thing that I want to do before we end is that there are a few announcements. So Ben sent out an email early this morning. I think you guys should have received it. There are 2 things that we want to highlight. So the first is the case interview groups, right? There will be a link to a Google Forms in that email, and then you basically go into that Google form, put your name down, things like that, and then we'll assign you into different groups to start doing these case interview preps, things like that. And we'll think about also having us involved in some of these groups to make sure that you guys are doing things correctly, things like that. The other thing also is that the deadline for McKinsey, Bain, and BCG is, I think, December 1st or December 3rd. And so as part of that, it's going to be...
There's one on November 30th.
There's one on November 30th too, right? So the thing with that is that we want to make sure that your guys' resumes are in good shape for these consulting companies. So if you guys want a professional review with me or Jeremy, sign up using a link that's provided. So then you would go there, and then there would be office hours for me and Jeremy to review your resumes. Send us also a PDF copy of your resume so that we can review it beforehand. And then when you guys actually get there for that one-on-one, we can just take a red pen and go through your resume, how to change it, things like that. So
we're going to send you out like a little structure. It should really follow like the action, complexity, like challenge type structure.
Yeah. So
I know people have classes, so we should let them go.
yeah, great. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you guys.
Yeah.
Great.